everybody, can you hear me? Okay. When I first began researching Francis Marion for a biography, I really knew very little about him beyond the Disney television series from the late 1950s. And so the first thing I did to learn about him was the first thing most people do in that situation. I Googled him. And after the standard Wikipedia entry, the first things that popped up were all these articles in the British press in the year 2000 as part of a backlash reaction to Mel Gibson's movie, The Patriot, which was very loosely based on Marion. I stress very loosely. One of these British journalists said that Marion was a man given to, quote, slaughtering Indians for fun and regularly raping his female slaves. The popular British historian Christopher Hibbert was quoted as saying that Marion was very active in the persecution of the Cherokee Indians and not at all the sort of chap who should be celebrated as a hero. An anonymous film company source admitted that the film was originally conceived as a factual biography, but that the protagonist was fictionalized and renamed Benjamin Martin once the makers, quote, got wind of Marion's true history. Wow, I thought this doesn't sound very good. Well, it took maybe another couple hours of research on the internet to realize that these accusations from the British press were overblown at best, and in most cases outright false and simply made up. And as I've come to learn more about Marion, I'm convinced that the Brits in this case were mostly just guilty of sour grapes. They may be our friends, but they still regret losing the war. Unfortunately, some of these allegations have crept into thinking in the United States. For example, Marion's alleged mistreatment of people of color has been cited by opponents of a statue and memorial to him in Washington, D.C. But in a way, it's Marion's prior biographers who created the void which has opened the door to some of this revisionist thinking. As they say, nature abhors a vacuum. And given the almost total absence of any discussion of Marion's relations with African Americans and Native Americans in the prior biographies, we shouldn't be surprised that the revisionists would grab the microphone. So I want to talk a little today about Marion and people of color. The first thing we have to remember about Francis Marion is that he was a man of his time and place. And of course, that means that as a South Carolinian, he came from a family of slave owners. His grandfather, Benjamin Marion from France, ended up dying owning 32 slaves, the value of which represented 80% of his entire estate. It's not clear how many slaves Marion's father owned, probably fewer, because he wasn't as successful a planter or businessman as Benjamin, the grandfather. But Marion's brother, Gabriel, at one time owned up to 140 slaves. Francis himself is reputed to have owned about 20 slaves at the time of the Revolution. Not a huge number, probably because Pond Bluff, his plantation, wasn't that large. And so what do we know about his relations with his slaves? I have to admit, not a whole lot in terms of specifics, but there's evidence that he enjoyed good relations with them. Most of you have probably heard about Buddy, his faithful manservant. William James calls him Oscar, which may have been his real name, because when he was honored by presidential proclamation in 2006, he was identified as Oscar, but he went by the nickname Buddy. Buddy has been described as a childhood companion and sort of foster brother to Marion, and he was with him throughout the Revolution. A claimed descendant of Oscar Marion describes him not only as a soldier, but as Marion's personal assistant, sous chef, bugler, and oarsman. He apparently also played the fiddle because Marion bought one for him right after the war. Now, Buddy was the son of June, that's a male, who was an overseer for Marion, and June's wife, Chloe, who worked as a cook and a domestic. As far as I can tell, June and Chloe were both African Americans, as were Buddy and Buddy's sister, Phoebe. But it's possible they had some mixed blood as well. Phoebe went on to have a child by a Native American of unknown name. Her daughter, Peggy, was described as a mustie, which at the time usually referred to people who shared African and Native American ancestry, as distinguished from those who were a mixture of European and African. Now, probably around the time he acquired Pond Bluff in 1773, or a little after, Marion made out a will that gave preferential treatment to this family of slaves. I'm not going to go through all of it, but I want to read you some of the highlights in his original language, which I think has some misspellings which were common back then. But anyway, he says, skipping to second, I enfranchise and make free my faithful Negro man named June, and my good old nurse Willoughby. I also make free the musty girl Peggy, the daughter of Phoebe. These 3 slaves, I declare, are free from all bondage and slavery, whatever. I give to my enfranchised slave June 20 pounds sterling per annum as long as he lives. I give and bequeath to my enfranchised slave Willoughby 1 suit of clothes and 20 pounds per annum as long as she lives. I give and bequeath to my enfranchised slave Peggy, the daughter of Phoebe, Peggy is the musty girl, suitable clothing, that is to say, 1 winter suit and 1 summer suit of clothing, each just consist of 1 gown, 1 petticoat, and a shift. This donation to be annually till she comes to the age of 15 years, and, this is important, I order that she be learned to read and write, to be paid out of my estate, and that she shall have a living on my plantation till she arrives at the age of 15. This is sort of a curious document. It frees the slave June, the overseer, but not his wife, Chloe, nor their son, Buddy. Buddy's sister, Phoebe, also remains a slave, but her daughter, Peggy, the musty, is made free. And the provision for Peggy's education was actually contrary to South Carolina law at the time, which made it a crime to teach a slave to write. A 100 sterling pound fine if you did so. Still, I think it shows the basically humane and generous side of Marion that most of us have come to know and admire in him. He evidently had tender feelings for this core group of slaves. Now, as long as we're talking about this group, I want to flash forward to the end of the war and then the end of Marion's life. At the end of the war, Marion comes back to Pond Bluff and writes to Peter Oree to say that he's down to, quote, 10 working Negroes. One source, William Body, says that's not including the aforementioned June, Chloe, Buddy, Phoebe, and Peggy. According to Body, those 5, plus the working 10, voluntarily moved over from Pond Bluff during the war to Belle Isle, the plantation of Marion's late brother Gabriel, who Marion was the guardian for. One of Marion's cousins was running Belle Isle during the war. Although we don't know when they made that move, these few slaves, it was probably around the time the British confiscated Marion's Pond Bluff plantation in the fall of 1780. And so then this group, plus the 10 working field hands, went with him back to Pond Bluff after the war. So that's some evidence of loyalty and decent circumstantial evidence that Marion was a humane master, which is consistent with his character. Now, if you do the math, that still leaves 5 or so, maybe 10 slaves who didn't stay with him. What happened to them? William James says they were taken away by the British, which is certainly possible. The British did take a lot of slaves forcibly from Whig plantations. In fact, Marion and his brigade spent a fair amount of time trying to prevent that from happening. But at least one of Marion's slaves, according to British Army records, escaped to the British lines and ended up resettling in Nova Scotia in a settlement called Birchtown, named for a British general. And a lot of this escaping activity happened too, because the British advertised that any slaves who came over voluntarily would get their freedom at the end of the war. The British didn't always honor that promise, by the way. Now, who knows whether this particular slave was really an ex-slave of Marion? It could be like those dozens or hundreds of soldiers in their pension applications who said they served under Marion. So, but that's what the record says. When Marion died in 1795, his inventory listed him with 74 slaves, comprising over half the value of his estate. Just 5 years before that, in 1790, in the census, he was credited with 194 slaves. The census wasn't always accurate, so you can take that for what it was. I don't know how to reconcile those two figures, although here's a possible explanation. As you know, Marion married late in life to his cousin, Mary Vidot, and according to her inventory at death in 1815, she had 44 slaves. And then Francis Dwight Marion, their adopted son, had about 150 slaves at his death in 1833. If you add those two together, you get 194, which could just be a coincidence, or maybe there was some shuffling back and forth between Marion and Francis Dwight. Now, when Marion died, he had a revised will, which he made out after his marriage. In 1787, he made a new will, and he redated it again in 1792. Turns out it wasn't valid, at least as to real property, because it was not witnessed, which was also true of his first will, the one I showed you. But it's still relevant, they're both still relevant to show his intent and state of mind. And what's interesting is that he does not emancipate any slaves in his final will. Not his loyal buddy, who shows up in his inventory as the very first slave, nor Peggy the Musty, who was to have been freed under the original will, and she's still around at his death. June was also supposed to have been freed too, but I think he had passed on by that time. Same was, I believe, true of Willoughby. Their names don't show up. So it's something of a mystery as to why he didn't free any slaves in the final will. There's a couple of theories. One, manumission, that is the freeing of slaves by their masters, was becoming increasingly unpopular in the South, including in South Carolina. By law in South Carolina, in fact, an emancipated slave had to leave the colony within 6 months or face re-enslavement and sale at a public auction with consequent separation from family. So maybe that played a part in his thinking. But I think probably the reason was similar. He was married now and had an adopted son and felt his main loyalty was now to them, and leaving it to them to free whatever slaves they would choose to or not in their wills. Another unanswered question, sort of a touchy topic. Did Marion ever whip or authorize the whipping of his slaves? And I'm talking mostly here about his field workers, since his core group of Buddy's family, by all indications, were treated well. As to the others, there's no specific evidence one way or the other. On the one hand, as we've seen, Marion was a humane and fair man and not the type of person who would go in for cruel or gratuitous punishment. On the other hand, he was a stern disciplinarian with his soldiers, many of whom were whipped for various misdeeds. Now, when he was in command of the militia during his partisan period, he didn't really have the power to administer corporal punishment to his soldiers. I think there were times when he would have liked to, and he even went so far as to threaten death to anyone found guilty of plundering, whether from black or white. But the militia in 1780 and 81 were basically volunteers, and if he was too hard on them, they could just tell him to go take a hike, I'm out of here. In fact, he told Peter Oree that a militia command was a, quote, skulking position, with the commander almost at the mercy of his men. Now, that was not true when he was a continental commander earlier in the war, from 1775 to early 1780. He had control then, and he could and did often order and carry out corporal punishment to his soldiers for bad behavior in that time frame, such as 50 or 100 lashes on a bare back. And so I guess my point is, I think we'd have to be a little naive to believe that he never ordered a flogging for any of his slaves, over whom, after all, he had total control. It would have been the rare slave owner at that time who never did. But in the end, we really don't know. I'm going to talk very briefly about his relations with Native Indians. You've heard from Karen about the Cherokee Wars. I'm not going to repeat too much of that. Yes, atrocities were committed, as the British and press in 2000 said, burning of homes, burning of crops, etc. There's no evidence that Marion personally committed any atrocities against the Indians during that time, at least as a matter of choice, although it's likely that he may have participated in some by order from Grant, as he says in his letter. As to the letter, whether Marion penned those exact words about over here, the poor creatures, I could scarcely refrain from tears, maybe, maybe not. The letter is written in a more flowery style than he employed in his military writings, but very few of his private writings exist, so it's possible that this highly personal message was in fact his own. It's also possibly relevant that Peter Horry didn't dispute this letter in his written comments on Weems's book. And in any event, I think the sentiments reflected in the letter are similar to those he would express 20 years later when he participated in a war just as vicious and brutal. So let's talk a little bit about that war. It's also a matter of record that when he first showed up in General Gates' camp in July 1780 with about 20 volunteers, this is after the fall of Charleston, that he had some black soldiers with him. Some sources say he also had some Catawba Indians who were enemies of the Cherokee. I don't want to oversell this. I mean, this creates the impression that 1/4 of his brigade was Native American and 1/4 African American. There's really no documentary support for that. Some historians have sort of blithely stated that Marion had lots of free African Americans and Indians fighting for him. I don't think the evidence really supports that. In terms of documented examples of free people of color serving with him, it's pretty sparse. There's maybe a half a dozen who show up. So my guess is in terms of actual free persons of color as opposed to slaves, the number who served in Marion's brigade was pretty small. Nevertheless, even if it's just a few, it does tend to show that Marion at least did not have a reputation as a cruel slave master or an especially virulent racist, or else the free African Americans probably would have stayed away from him. I think that Marion did recognize that slaves generally desired freedom, as evidenced by his recommendation as part of a legislative committee in 1783 that one Antigua be emancipated. This is someone who Governor John Rutledge had promised to make free and who had helped obtain information behind enemy lines, frequently at the risk of his own life. Marion's committee recommended that it comply with the promise Rutledge made, and Antigua, his wife, and children were liberated from what the General Assembly called, quote, the yoke of slavery, a phrase which sort of refutes the notion that even well-treated slaves would have preferred bondage to freedom. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about Sumter's law. Briefly, for those who are not familiar with it, it wasn't an actual law, but it was a policy adopted by Thomas Sumter, the militia brigadier general, to offer compensation to enlistees in the form of horses, clothing, equipment, and slaves taken from Tories. Sumter and Andrew Pickens used it to recruit people to serve 10 months as state troops, and both Nathaniel Greene and John Rutledge gave it their tacit approval, at least. But Francis Marion wouldn't have any part of it. Now, it's possible that he had a philosophical opposition to using human beings as bounties, but that was probably a small element of his thinking. I think the main reasons were, one, he didn't like plunder generally, that is, taking private property for public use. And in addition, if you had to offer a guy plunder to enlist, he's probably not the kind of true blue patriot you want fighting for you or who you can rely on. Now, toward the end of the war, in early 1782, Marion did what some people might consider a sort of flip-flop on the issue. This relates to the Confiscation Act that the legislature passed to take plantations and property from the worst of the Tories. Marion sat on a committee to come up with ways of raising 2 new Continental regiments in South Carolina to meet the quota set by Congress. And the plan the committee came up with was to give each man who enlisted a bounty of 1 sound Negro between the ages of 10 and 40 for each year of service to be taken from the confiscated estates. Now, on the surface, this seems inconsistent with his opposition to Sumter's law, but there was a difference. Sumter's men had not always been so fastidious about limiting their plunder to Tories. Sometimes they take from Whigs as well for private gain. This new program was to be regulated and administered by the state and was targeted at those deemed most guilty of disloyalty. Now, maybe you'd say that's not much of a distinction, but to Marion, who favored the rule of law, not anarchy, I think it made a difference. And also by that time, late in the war, there was sort of a notion that the Whigs had given it the office, and it was not inappropriate to take Tory property as a means of recruiting soldiers, which had gotten harder and harder as the war wound down and people were tired of fighting. So Marion went along with this plan, although I have a feeling in his heart of hearts, he wasn't greatly in favor of it. Of course, implicit in these programs was the idea that slaves were property, which they were under South Carolina law. And there's no doubt Marion fully concurred with that view. As a further example, he negotiated a couple of truces or ceasefires with some particularly troublesome Tories who hung out in the Little Petey area north of Georgetown, and the terms of those treaties required the Tories to give back any property they'd stolen from the Whigs, including slaves. So on that issue of slaves as property, Marion was right in the mainstream of thought among his peers. I'm going to jump forward a little bit through a couple slides. Another subject that's received some attention, but not a lot, is Marion's execution of slaves who were on the Tory or British side. Now, a couple things you have to remember about Francis Marion and capital punishment. Number one, he didn't go for executing a captured enemy combatant just because the person was considered a particularly obnoxious or atrocious person or was guilty of terrible atrocities against the Whigs. In fact, he personally intervened a number of times to prevent his men from doing so. And he also tried to treat prisoners of war well. Didn't always have the food or resources or facilities to do that, but he certainly didn't inflict unnecessary punishment. Then on the other hand, he didn't have any hesitation about hanging spies or people who were caught providing aid and comfort to the enemy. So if you were just an ordinary enemy combatant, that was one thing, even if you were a bad person. That was not a hanging offense per se. But if you engaged in deceitful or treacherous behavior, like a spy, that made you fair game for execution, and that was true of both sides in the war. Now, I would like to think Marion viewed it the same way whether the spy was black or white. But it just so happens that slaves were used a lot by the British to spy or gather and carry provisions to the army and the like, so they were maybe disproportionately at risk of being caught and executed. And there's evidence that Marion did execute slaves for such things. According to one pension statement, in Marion's final successful effort to capture Georgetown, he enlisted the help of local plantation slaves to dig trenches, one of whom allegedly furnished cattle and provisions to the British. And according to this pensioner, Marion had the, quote, yellow man hanged, which was a term then for a light-skinned mulatto. That's the Loftus-Motherland pension. Another incident the British press latched onto is the one involving Harry the slave. I don't know if you're familiar with that. I want to read from a signed certification dated November 27, 1782, from two British officers. I do hereby certify that a Negro man named Harry, the property of Mr. Galliard, that was a noted Tory, was frequently employed as a spy by order of Lord Rawdon, in which capacity he was very serviceable, and that after his lordship's departure he was employed in the same manner for the late Commandant Balfour and enrolled as a guide in the quartermaster's general department. That being sent out from Monk's Corner for intelligence, he was taken prisoner by Marion's party, by whom he was beheaded, and his head set upon a stake when General Gould's army passed the Greenland Swamp. Signed in Charleston by Major John Doyle, that's the brother of the man who destroyed the Snow's Island camp, and John McKinnon, the deputy quartermaster. A couple things about this. Greenland Swamp is under Lake Marion today. It's about 10, 15 miles from Utah Springs, 30 miles north of Monk's Corner, roughly. Most of the sources which talk about this incident assume that the beheading took place around November 27, 1782, which is the date of the certification. I don't think that's right. That's only a couple weeks before the British left Charleston, and the British didn't have their army anywhere near Monk's Corner that late. General Paston Gould certainly was not out in the field then. In fact, he'd retired to Charleston due to illness in the fall of 1781. I believe the actual incident was most likely around the time of the Battle of Eutaw Springs, or just after, in September 1781, because both Doyle and Gould were in that area just after the battle. My guess is that this certification is documenting an incident that took place in September 1781. And incidentally, Steve Smith, who many of you know, has looked into this for an article he's submitting for publication, and he and I independently came to the same conclusion, that it was September 1781 and not November 1782. Now, the second thing about this incident, Marion was actually under orders from Governor John Rutledge in September 1781 to execute any slaves found to have spied for the enemy. So I don't particularly doubt that if Marion caught this Harry the spy, he would have ordered him executed. I do think it unlikely that Marion would have approved of a grisly beheading and putting it on a stake. That would have been out of character, for at least for him, maybe not for some of his men. The question I still have in my mind is whether was Marion maybe a little less inhibited, a little less squeamish about hanging people of color than white people, even if both were spies? I don't have any way of answering that. I'd like to believe he was mostly colorblind when it came to executions, but I don't know. You know, there was a spectrum of beliefs at that time about African-American slaves. Let me put that. At the one end, you had people like John Lawrence, and there weren't many of them back then, who did regard black persons as full human beings with an entitlement to human rights and equal dignity. At the other extreme were people who considered slaves to be barely above the level of livestock, if that. I do believe Francis Marion was closer to the John Lawrence end of the spectrum than most people in terms of treatment of slaves. Mainly because he was a genuinely compassionate person in his dealings with other people. He was probably a benevolent master, better than most. I would not go so far as to claim that Marion was, quote, ahead of his time on racial matters in the way that John Lawrence was. Francis Marion was, as I've said, a man of his time and of his place, and he needs to be judged in relation to the standards of the day, not today. He was not a saint, and the children's book approach to him does him no favors. All that said, I believe he had a spark of humanity within him, a unique spark, if you will, that set him apart from most men of his time and place. And I think if this issue had been addressed a little more transparently in the prior books on Marion, we might not have seen the kind of allegations that we saw from the British press in 2000. Unfortunately, those stories are still circulating on the internet, and it's stories like that that have been holding up a memorial to Marion in Washington, D.C. But I believe the objections to Marion are based on factual misconceptions. Now, you know, people can disagree on these things, but there's certainly some people from the past, like Nathan Bedford Forrest, the founder of the KKK, who may be fair targets for censure in today's world. Francis Marion is not one of them. In closing, I would add that if anyone has any interesting tidbits of information on this subject, I'd be happy to hear from you and consider it for my forthcoming book. Well, this subject is going to be a relatively small part of my book, but I think it will be an important part. And hopefully it will remove some of the taint that others have tried to place upon Francis Marion and help people see the true man and great man for what he was. Thank you.
Please take a very quick run to the coffee pot as soon as we can move the next
questions or not?
We'll get started.
Do we have time for questions or not?
Or see if anybody wants to ask a quick question.
A quick question. John will be around. He's not going to run and hide, so you can talk to him out in the other room.